tape recorder's busted. Boo!
Unpleasant dream.
Welcome to our finale. I kinda wish I hadn't limited myself to just 3 parts here, because the more I learn about British computer gaming in the 80s, the more I want to keep learning. And not just for the games that are controversial, however you define controversial. We've been stretching that term quite a bit here, and this stretching will only continue. But as promised, I am going to deliver unto thee 4 video games to discuss today. Ones I'm sure will satiate your spooky appetite. And then some. How so? Well, what's the one thing that's commonly associated with Halloween? Candy? The color orange? Pumpkins? Copious amounts of drinking? Witness statements? No, you silly gourd, it's death. And what's one thing on YouTube that's guaranteed to get you views regardless of context? Stringing together a compilation of death scenes from older and modern games, especially adventure and horror games. There's a good chance some of y'all have watched one of these compilations, and back in the early days of YouTube, it was one of the best ways to discover these older titles. Who cares if it spoils the plot or ruins the gameplay experience? I wouldn't have learned about games like Space Quest 3, Blue Force, or even Clock Tower if it weren't for videos like these. And that's how I discovered our spooky subjects for this finale. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce to you the Horrorsoft Quadfecta. How much will the player character have to suffer until we're satisfied? The answer may spook you to your core. And we can start answering that with another introduction to another big gaming figure. And one who's not even British. This man is Scott Adams. No, not that Scott Adams. This Scott Adams. And Scott got his start in video games during the late 70s with a text-based adventure game titled Adventureland. Adventureland was one of the many successful games inspired by William Crowther's landmark adventure title, Adventure, both of which have become some of the most influential games in the early days of the medium, especially after Scott released Adventureland's source code to the public. He may not be repping for the Union Jack, so to speak, but he is a gracious and talented programmer, and the success of Adventureland prompted him to start up his own games company, Adventure International. That's a misnomer though, as the company's games were strictly national at the start. But as Scott developed and released several more titles well into the early 80s, he caught the attention of another startup overseas, the UK-based Callisto Software. Formed by one Michael Woodruff, his company was an offshoot of the dinky little computer shop he built up within his family's music shop, and they started out by importing a number of popular titles to sell to his loving customers, including Scott's games. The pair developed a good working relationship that further evolved when Mikey realized these games hadn't been ported to the big British computers of the day. With the help of a willing UK programmer though, who coincidentally was responsible for one of those games influenced by Adventureland, Mike got Scott's games officially converted to these systems and even reformed Callisto Software into the UK base for Adventure International, thus finally making its name 100% true. That said, both entities were separate from each other. Scott had merely granted them permission to use that name, and from here the two AIs go on relatively similar paths with strikingly different endings. Much like the last 2 developers we examined, these 2 developers got into the licensed game during the mid-80s, with Mikey and friends making titles based off those nasty little gremlins, and Scotty Boy having released titles based on Marvel comic characters like the Hulk, the Thing, the Human the Torch, and the Spider-Man. Now, take a wild guess as to which of the 2 AIs survived in the increasingly competitive gaming environment. If you guessed the Brits, a cup of tea for you. After all, this miniseries ain't about stupid Americans, and Marvel heroes weren't the juggernauts of the entertainment industry that they are today. So it's no wonder that the folks who developed a game based on the adventures of Buckaroo Banzai across the 8th dimension couldn't get a hit from their Marvel games. AIUS's waning successes were followed by abrupt bankruptcy. forcing AI UK to go through another name change since Scott retained the name in spite of his company's destruction. The team settled on Adventuresoft and continued outputting more licensed adventure titles for much of the rest of the decade, during which Woodruff had conjured up a small team to work on a spooky original project. This 18-month-long development venture saw the creation of a brand new adventure game interface, and the project utilizing that interface was released for the Amiga, MS-DOS, and Atari ST in late 1989. A personal nightmare. The days of Captain America and fighting fantasy were over, as Adventuresoft went in this horrible direction. I wrote this down months ago and didn't change it. Fuck you. As with the other two games, I did play A Personal Nightmare for myself. I also played the other three games we're going to be discussing here. During all of these critiques, however, I want you to keep this in mind. I'm not very experienced with older adventure games. The Freddy Fish series and that one Titanic game were the closest I ever got to that kind of format in my youth, and I have since become more familiar with the newer adventure styles of Phoenix Wright, 999, Danganronpa, Famicom Detective Club, 12 Minutes maybe. Ones where the logic and the puzzles are more simplified to the nth degree, and while failure can occur, it isn't omnipresent. So I'll simply be describing my experiences with the games as well as the player character deaths that we're all here for. I just wouldn't be the best person to judge the intricacies of how they play out. So if you want a more detailed critique from a more experienced adventure gamer, check out this fella. He does pretty good work. Also, for the record, the gameplay footage I'll be providing is from the MS-DOS versions, because that's what GOG has. Okay, got your expectations set? Good, let's get to the spooky shit. A Personal Nightmare is an interesting beast. The game has you play as a young lad who's returned to their hometown after some time away, only to find it has gone through some odd and spooky changes. The town's vicar, i.e. our MC's father, has gone missing, and many of the regulars are acting stranger than usual, so they're tasked with investigating these strange ongoings while not trying to get killed in the process. This is performed by using that built-from-the-ground-up interface I had mentioned earlier, aka the Adventure Graphic Operating System, or AGOS, and it was created by one of the credited programmers for the title, Sir Alan Cox. It's an odd mixture of your standard point-and-click elements, as well as your standard command-based and parser prompts, allowing any of the three to be used to interact with the world at any time. There are also these directional commands represented by a compass that are very dungeon crawler-esque, and most interestingly, the game has given our hero 4 in-game days to figure out what the hell's going around these parts, with the twist being these in-game days run in real time. So certain events occurring at certain times and in certain areas are only available during certain days and certain points of those days. It's certainly a unique approach. The implementation, on the other hand, this is one of those adventure games content to just plop you right into its game world and let you figure out what you're supposed to do, so what ended up happening in my case was that the vicar of Dibley here bumbled around his hometown like he's never been there, until he wandered out too late at night and a vampire glopped into his tasty neck. So just like the last few Halloween parties I've been to. No person should be on the witness stand more than 5 times in their life. This isn't necessarily a point of criticism, because figuring this shit out yourself is the appeal to a lot of early adventure games, but even with being able to save at any time, I felt overwhelmed by A Personal Nightmare structure, and that AGOS system makes the simple process of navigation, or hell, talking to people, kinda confusing, and you better get used to hearing this word, clunky. Like, you have separate actions for locking and unlocking stuff as well as opening and closing things, and God, don't even get me started on the amount of useless items that mess with my need to hoard everything in case I need to use them at some point. I don't think it's a bad game, though. I love the town's moody atmosphere and the weird oversaturated color choices for the characters and the environment. It creeped me out, and on more than a few occasions freaked me out. If you have a centered object on a black background with sudden movement, that shit's gonna get to me. All this madness does a great job of making it feel like our poor protagonist is trapped in a nightmare that they can't wake up from. Maybe that's why it's all so mysterious and alien to him. Though, it's not like having them actually sleep will do them any good, because that could summon a bunch of toy soldiers who will shoot him to death. This is one of the sillier deaths our character can stumble into, but they can also find themselves neck to throat with a vicious guard dog, being horrifically burned by an annoyed witch awoken from her slumber while he's prancing around in their house, or getting a knife plunged into his forehead after a sink demon traps them in the kitchen. It is absolutely worth a purchase, 10 out of 10. I don't know though, this kind of goofy stuff is in sharp contrast to the general vibe this game produces. If only there was some indication as to why that could be the case. Well, Elvira. Didn't change that one either, actually added that during the polishing phase. It appears we need to embark on another history lesson. This is Elvira, the Mistress of the Dark, a character invented and performed by comedian, actress, LGBT icon Cassandra Peterson. The character originated from the comedy troupe that she was a part of, alongside other folks like Paul Rubens, Phil Hartman, John Paragon, as well as a whole bunch of other people you saw on Pee-wee's Playhouse. And they soon became intertwined with the horror host genre after Peterson got the role to host the next iteration of the LA-based local TV series, Fright Night. Retitled Movie Macabre, she would screen a number of B-movies, all of them horror and sci-fi films, some public domain, most of them crappy, intercut with comedic skits and banter. Rather typical of this format if you're familiar with the likes of Svengoolie and Count Gordeval. But the success of movie Macarena propelled the Elvira character into national pop culture, and the two biggest reasons as to why were her boisterous personality and goth culture being fucking awesome. You can watch the show's catalog on the YouTubes or elsewhere to get the gist of her thing, but if you wanted the condensed version, may I introduce you to the film named after her and her moniker. That's right, fellas, it's not just another licensed game, it's another movie-based licensed game. And this horror comedy classic has Elvira going across the country to chase an inheritance while riling up the stingy, sexless townsfolk in the process and listening to the worst fucking saxophone preset I have heard in a goddamn minute. Oh, Jesus. Fuck, make it stop. It's not a great film. But there's a bluntness to the corny jokes that's weirdly refreshing, and those golden Hasberries can say whatever the hell they want. Peterson owns her dialogue.
Listen, young lady, I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you most certainly don't fit in this town. Why, you don't even fit in that dress.
Listen, sister, if I want your opinion, I'll beat it out of you.
Is it necessary to watch it in order to get into the game? No, I watched it afterwards. But they have the same title, so I thought it was worth mentioning the distinction. However, it is curious that these Brits were the ones who went for the licensed title based on her, because based on my research, Elvira was practically unknown in the UK. According to Michael, though, they would not have made any connection whatsoever if he and Peterson didn't have the same talent agent. And who better to represent their horror series than the Mistress of the Dark herself? That said, she seemed to be hands-off with the project, which was a great source of frustration for the game's artist, Tiaman Ermic. He couldn't just go off of publicity photos, no, he had to meet the woman in person. And yet that never happened. I can think of two more reasons as to why he seemed so desperate to see Elvira in the flesh.
Nice tits.
Hey, I have no shame, and clearly Elvira doesn't either. Based on previews, it seemed like the game's development occurred either in tandem or soon after Personal Nightmare was finished, and it saw release for all the same platforms in late 1990, including the Commodore 64. But that came a bit later, and I'll explain why later. The game supposedly takes place following the events of the film, as it revolves around Elvira inheriting another home of another long-forgotten ancestor, and if you know the film, you'll realize that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but the comparisons end there, so let's not dwell on it. Also, this is Elvira we're talking about. The main difference is that the ancestor spirit in this mansion gets realived while Elvira's sprucing the place up, and that summons a bunch of monsters, creatures, and other spooky things all over the premises, trapping Elvira inside. So now she has to rely on some freelance ghostbuster, as she describes him in the manual, to get shit sorted out. Like with Personal Nightmare though, the game doesn't exactly spell this out. For all I knew, Elvira and Bill Murray here had been thrown back into the medieval era by some nebulous being, Army of Darkness style. Dan Aykroyd promptly starts out his journey by getting captured and thrown into the cell as soon as he arrives, whereupon Elvira saves him, insults him a few times, and sends him off with a tiny little knife and some other things. What are you trying to imply here, lady? Now, I didn't get this far initially, because I couldn't get the game past that point without crashing. I blame the DOSBox client. But after re-downloading ScumVM and running it from there, I was able to play the game to my heart's content, and the first observation I made was that it felt like we were in a more confined space than last time. We're only exploring a giant mansion castle area instead of a giant town, so that must mean the navigation and the interaction around here is much less annoying, right? Well, the back of the box boasts about the game's features, which include 800 rooms, 100 hours of gameplay, 300 objects, and 100 enemies to fight because this is now an RPG with combat and leveling and spellcrafts on top of being an adventure game. Getting more dungeon crawlery by the minute. Yeah, for as nice as the game looks, the aimless wandering is back in full force. The command and movement system is a bit less unwieldy than it was last time, but many of those rooms and items are empty and, again, useless, respectively, and navigation is somehow slower. Like, I understand that these games ran on multiple floppy disks that you had to swap out at various points, but did they have to keep in the loading transitions that this is likely a consequence of? As for those RPG elements, fighting is a one-on-one real-time affair, relying on split-second timing to parry enemy attacks coming from either your left or your right, and then using the tiny knife or whatever else you find to hack away the bastard until they defend themselves or collapse. It's clunky, but it works. Except it takes way too long to kill enemies, which you need to do in order to fight some of the tougher ones later, like any RPG ever, and the small amount of health items available were not helping the situation. You can also cast spells that are a bit more effective in combat, although crafting them requires using some of the 10,000 items featured in the game, and I could not for the life of me figure out how to interact with the recipe book. I did manage to find these pretty cool catacombs and this sweet-looking sewer monster who attacked Harold Ramis with a skelly head, but after flooding the area and learning I didn't have the right items I needed to traverse these newly flooded areas, I went to the guide to get to the good stuff. Again, inexperienced. That good stuff is a lot more prevalent and gruesome than Personal Nightmare. For example, losing any fight means Ernie Hudson here gets decapitated or their head completely caved in. Though, if you were just kind of wandering around these castle grounds forever, it would seem like there are less of those sudden deaths that were in Personal Nightmare. But take one step outside or even inside and you'll find that there are plenty of them. And not just their own. See this guy here with the cool looking crow? Pretty good Halloween costume, wouldn't you say? Well, don't get too close because he'll sick the bird on a Christian wig and pluck their eyes out. See this sad-looking prisoner? There's a reason he's been imprisoned, because he'll turn into a werewolf and tear out Kate McKinnon's throat in visceral detail compared to Personal Nightmare. But forget that, the real gem comes during the halfway point, when Elvira gets chased out of the kitchen that she's been stuck in by a mad lady cook, and after Leslie Jones tries to take care of her, she takes care of him. I'd have a bowl of that, I don't know about y'all. Reviews of the time definitely took note of the uptick in graphic violence, which admittedly is lessened by the campier feeling and Elvira's humor, so it would appear that Horrorsoft took upon the task of making the sequel even spookier. Elvira 2, The Jaws of Cerberus, came out for all of the same platforms about a year or so after Elvira 1. The scenario is a bit similar, as Elvira has gotten kidnapped again by the big doggo himself, and someone who's probably a different protagonist from the first game, but I'm assuming it's the same schmuck anyway, so I can keep making Ghostbusters references, has to save her. How's this for a change of pace? The spookiness takes place in a haunted movie studio featuring a number of horror movie sets that Paul Rudd has to navigate through to get the stuff that they need to save Elvira and yada yada yada, forget all that. I have a fucking bone to pick. The game starts out with Frank Welker needing to enter the studio, which is done by breaking into the security booth and unlocking the front gate. Don't mind the guard who's stuffed away in the closet, one simply needs to use his keys to turn on the security system ignition and enter a specific code. But what code, you may ask? Well, games during the floppy disk and cassette tape era were very easy to copy over to a blank disk or tape. And one of the many copy protection methods developers would implement to deter this practice forced players to input some code of some sort by using whatever decipherer was included in the original packaging. In the case of Elvira 2, you would use this code wheel that had a number of words, symbols, and numbers, manipulating its layers based on the images and words presented on screen to find the code that corresponds with them. Should you fail to correctly enter the code 3 times, Elvira will kick you out of the game. So without this wheel, you could not get past this game's introduction in the early 90s. 30 years later, the version on GOG has since been cracked so that players could bypass that protection entirely. So you can put in any combination you want, and the game should accept it and continue on. I say should because that was not happening with my copy, regardless if I ran it through the GOG DOSBox client or ScumVM. And so, I did what any normal person would do in this situation, and found a digital version of the code wheel to go through the manual decoding process just like those 90 kids did back in the day when things were cool. All we needed was bop bop bop. It didn't work. I don't know why, it just would not take it. And I looked through forums and help pages to figure out if this was the case for other people too, but I never got a solid answer. I could only assume that my copy was busted, so I just found another emulated copy on archive.org. This is why you dipshits should leave archive.org alone. I don't give a shit if your justification is righteous or for your fucking cartoon villain doing this for a cheeky giggle. You do not fuck with the I think the game froze up. Back in the day. I'm sure none of y'all would have blamed me if I gave up from here and just showed the cool death sequences, but with a bit more experimenting and perseverance, I figured out the solution. And it was quite simple. I just needed to run the game's executable without putting it through any client whatsoever, and boom, we're back in business. So if anyone's having similar problems playing this game, try that. You're welcome. Fitting that this game put me through this bullshit from the start, because it did not let up in that respect after getting into the studio. An adventure RPG it remains, and the commands have been more simplified as they're icon-based. Moving about is still a bit confusing, but whatever. There's also more hints available from this rad Native American dude, and only 3 sets to traverse. How could you go wrong with this setup? Easy! Make the combat fucking atrocious. You thought the parry-focused combat in the first game was clunky? Try dealing with switching between 4 different combat styles that are difficult to discern in how effective they are, while the attacks dealt on the Finn Wolfhard here produce random amounts of damage to different parts of the body as shown in this very unnecessary revamp of the health interface. The magic system also got a revamp, but this time it was for the better, as it has a more tangible effect in combat, and crafting spells is also easier to work with now that the items needed to do so are mostly centered in one area. But honestly, my goodwill had been whittled down, so I just tried to get Carlton killed in as many unique ways as possible. As had been hinted at before, the atmosphere for this one is a lot less silly than the first Elvira game, i.e. it's more determined to actually scare the player. And this works for me, especially during the haunted house sequence, because god, look at these weird-ass creatures. And there's also this part here. I'm not apologizing for that. I did find these pretty cool bugs though. I don't even mind if they turn Terra Strong green. Unfortunately, in terms of their horrificness, those death screens were, at best, a lateral move, at worst, a big step back. I know it's kind of hard to top a bird plucking out the eyes of Ray Parker Jr. here, and there are still some fun ones, but if you wanted to see the real violent stuff, that comes from the other characters spread throughout here, like this witch lady and the titular Cerberus. If you're able to push past the shittier combat and the still rather confusing navigation, Elvira 2 is pretty alright, but it's easily the worst game of the bunch so far. Before we move on though, I'm sure you've noticed we have been going over a lot of these gross and bloody shenanigans, and yet I am neglecting to mention whether or not any of this stuff was controversial. Well, for your information, Elvira 2 did cause controversy, in a very slight, albeit very interesting way. And to discuss that, we need to look at those Commodore 64 versions. The fact that both of these games made it to this system is kind of astounding. 8-bit conversions of 16-bit games are not easy to pull off regardless of the format. And it seemed like Horrorsoft didn't want to waste their time with that, so those duties were handled by Flare Software. This is yet another UK dev with another complicated history, but they have contributed to the Elvira brand alongside Horrorsoft by making Elvira the arcade game. Oh hey, there's another instance of 2 completely different games using the same license released around the same time, although that title is another misnomer. This side-scroller action game was never released in arcades, only home computers. I know the gameplay is kind of arcadey, but come on, it's the early 90s, you'd expect this to be in the arcade. at this point we're dealing with semantics. But speaking of titles, for whatever reason, Flare was not able to use the Jaws of Cerberus subtitle, so it had to be released as simply Elvira 2, even though the Mistress of the Dark subtitle had only been printed on the C64 versions of the first game. Fucking weird. As for how they look, well, the first one's fine, but my god, the second one is nigh incomprehensible compared to the original. And the changes didn't stop there, as per this interview with one of the game's programmers, Bruce Lefleur, alterations had to be made in order to appease certain markets. The US version getting some nudity removed, and the German version seeing the violence toned down. The nudity they seem to be referring to, by the way, is this pinup girl in the security booth. Not exactly R-rated, but they swapped it out with this. I think it's supposed to be a buff macho Fabio idol type, but it looks more like the pinup girl went topless to me. Like, I'm not applying the age restriction to this video, but you see what I mean, right? As for the violence, I'm not sure if it was a matter of censorship or a mere consequence of converting a 16-bit game with hundreds of available colors to an 8-bit machine with only 16 colors, but that's too nuanced an assumption, so let's just say they made it woke instead and move on. Boy, I can't wait for the year-end video, I'm so fucking excited! For our final entry, and the last Horrorsoft labeled game, the team opted out of the Elvira brand name because they were tired of making Elvira games, though their next title was to be yet another horror adventure RPG called Waxworks. It was developed during a 2-year period and was released for only the Amiga and MS-DOS in late 1992, and while it may not feature Elvira any longer, the spirit of the previous games is very much intact as it was inspired by another horror movie. 1988's Waxwork is more in line with those lower-budget B-movies that would be featured on Movie Macabre, and features a bunch of college-aged kids visiting this waxwork museum whose exhibits contain these odd pocket dimensions that have long-standing horror properties and universes playing out. Like, you got the Wolfman, you got the Vampire, you got the Mummy, the Masochist Pirates? Oh, that's a surprise. The film has about half the budget of the Elvira movie and consequently feels like an extended Tales from the Crypt episode with a tad bit more style, but more pointedly, I absolutely hated these spoiled-ass kids and their performances, so the first half was a struggle. Thankfully, the second half picks things up considerably, and there are far better actors giving far better performances to counteract the weak ones, all leading up to those final glorious 15 minutes. So I'd say it's worth a watch. Playing the game, though, you'd be under the impression that the developers had taken the Waxwork horror universe concept, combined it with the structure of Elvira 2, and just came up with their own story while somehow making it much gorier. Indeed, per this jumbled interview with Mike from early 1992, the team were going to include locales based on the one seen in the film, but that stuff would eventually get tweaked or cut out entirely, likely because they didn't actually have the license for the film at all, and probably didn't want to deal with any lawsuits. So Waxworks has you play as another nondescript individual whose twin brother has been possessed by an evil witch who long ago placed a curse on their ancestors. So with the help of the spirit of their deceased uncle and his weird time travel science contraption thingy, the hero needs to travel to 4 different eras represented by these waxworks and accomplish the quests found within each world to gather the material they need to vanquish the witch, save their brother, and most of all, the world. The 4 horror eras are as follows: Ancient Egypt, Victorian era London, some weird-ass zombie and vampire-infested graveyard, and monster plants in a mine. Not the most common horror eras, but personally, they make for the most interesting environments of the games that we've played so far. Actually, to be upfront, this was my favorite Horrorsoft game. I'll admit I didn't get super far into this one either. The most of it I had played was the Ancient Egypt level, but while there's still some leftover camp from the Elvira influence, it's easily the most unsettling overall. You think this stuff freaked me out? Try watching me attempt to navigate around this pyramid and the bug mines full screen.
Yeah, fuck.
It's also the most accessible game as they got rid of that stupid health system, simplified combat by removing the magic elements and showing visible, discernible damage on enemies, and offered an even more robust hint mechanic courtesy of the hero's uncle and his green orb of wonder. Look at this! I was able to figure out how to break this glass and solve this math puzzle without looking up a guide a single time! I'm so proud of myself. It's for these reasons that the game saw the most mixed reception of the four, which beforehand was generally positive, but what really sets it over the top though, once again, is the violence and the numerous ways our hero can meet their terrible fate. Some of it looks a bit silly, like with the Egypt levels, but then you get to London, which by the way revolves around the Jack the Ripper panic, and the need to escape the Popo and the angry mobs looking for the fucker, and it all starts off with one of his victims whose throat has been viciously torn open. The same can be done unto our hero if they're not careful, and if they get captured, they'll either get stomped out or hung by rope. I'm 90% sure that this is the most iconic image from the game. I vaguely recall seeing it at a few points in my internet life before digging into Horrorsoft. It is that memorable. Then there's the Graveyard Necromancer level with the never-ending zombies that already looked pretty disgusting, and losing to one of them grants us an image that rivals shit that you'd see on Dead of the Brain or House of the Dead. And finally, the Bug Alien Vine Plant, which... just savor these images. My god, this is a gold mine for horror fans. I'm not surprised I got that remake almost 30 years later. Watch out, Mary Whitehouse indeed. On that topic, the game did attract a little bit of controversy due to the gore, by way of an angry letter. Yep, one angry letter from one angry parent angrily submitted to Amiga Action, in response to the graphic screenshots that they had placed in their review. The columnist responded by stating that it would be irresponsible of them to not include such images, or else that wouldn't provide a full overview of the game in question. And that's a fair counterpoint, and before you think that the person would take this matter into their own hands a la Primal Rage, no further controversy ensued whatsoever. It makes me wonder if a games magazine had shown off the piss fatality, we could have avoided so many headaches. Following Waxworks, Horrorsoft would revert back to the AdventureSoft's name and establish a separate publishing firm before moving on to the more lighthearted comedic adventures of Simon the Sorcerer. Mike's son, Simon Woodruff, had become heavily involved with their games by this point, and would even go on to direct the second game of the series, as well as their oft-forgotten sci-fi adventure comedy game, The Feeble Files. The pairing would later fork off into another juncture from AdventureSoft under the name of Headfirst Productions, which released two games that had some of the most troubled developments for any game of the 2000s, Simon the Sorcerer 3D and Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. Yes, Mike and Simon were responsible for what's widely regarded as one of the most underrated horror games of all time, despite it bankrupting the company due to those development troubles. Mike mostly moved away from game development afterwards, although he did assist with re-releasing those AdventureSoft games under GOG, but Simon has stuck with the industry ever since, having also joined Sega of Europe for a few years, Rare for most of the 2010s, and most recently taking up a senior director role at Epic Games. What a resume. So there we go. 4 more British horror games with a variety of game over kills and nary a drop of controversy. Isn't that kind of amazing? The magazines and I have raved about the violent content of these games, and most of their covers had a warning about said violence, and these games sold pretty well, or at least well enough for Horrorsoft to keep producing them, so they were in the hands of a lot of people. And yet, an angry letter and some tiny little changes for some specific markets that you can hardly tell was the biggest controversies that sprouted from these games. We started off with a needless moral outrage about uncertified VHS horror films happening in parallel to the development for a game based on one of those uncertified VHS horror films. And now we just have to deal with some disparaging comments about gore in horror video games. Again, pretty amazing. Obviously, this isn't the best method to showcase such progression, and I probably could have spent all the time that I talked about these games discussing the original topics that were controversial. Maybe I haven't looked far enough into this extensive collection of old game magazines that I'm sourcing a lot of this information from, and had already featured a little info about the game's development, and I did try to get in touch with some of the people involved to see if I could get any more of that information, but I was not able to come up with anything. But in my defense, let me distract you with some more trivia. Scott Adams had cemented his legacy in the games industry, but continued tinkering around with the medium ever since, having most recently contributed to the crowdfunded indie adventure game series The Lost Legends of Redfall. Brian Howarth also moved around the industry a bunch and got into mobile game development. Tiemann Ermic would go on to work with Shovelware Factory and common YouTube reviewer arch nemesis, Data Design Interactive, for the majority of their existence. Alan Cox went on to become a massive figure in the open source programming community, thanks to his contributions to the Linux kernel. The Elvira and Waxworks games weren't published by AdventureSoft either, rather, Alkalade.
What could possibly go wrong?
And the music for Elvira 2 and Waxworks was composed by Gerald Woodruff, or Jez Woodruff, obviously another member of the Woodruff family, and a session musician who had worked on albums for Black Sabbath and Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin. It's crazy how no one was able to guess the topic for this video on Twitter and Blue Sky based on this. I guess I'm just too smart for everyone. So as this year's Halloween comes to a close, and we eagerly await the next haunting season, something, 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 something. I hope that will tide you over for now. And if not, here's footage of the Waxworks remake that I mentioned earlier, Curse of the Ancestors. It doesn't look good. Happy Halloween!